So welcome everybody. So the topics that we're going to cover, as Shannon already mentioned, is what defines an incident, and also looking at your team that you need to have in place and making sure that you have your plan in place before you actually have an incident, which is usually one of the best things to do. And then of course how it evolves over time, and then some of your obligations, as Shannon already pointed out. So I'm just basically repeating what he said. So let's get stuck into it. What defines an incident, and why do you need a plan in the first place? So if you're a little bit of a reader, and throughout the year various organizations put out their different threat reports. Symantec just pushed out one the other day. All of these reports have a number of things in common. So they'll all have things like phishing and ransomware and DDoSes, and that's fantastic. That gives you an idea of what you're fighting in the first place. But one of the things that's very common across all of them is that weak response, or a slow response, or a delayed response. Those are words that are common across pretty much every threat report that you come into. So organizations are slow to detect, and organizations are even slower to respond, or the response is inappropriate. And hopefully, today's webinar will help you kind of fix a number of those issues. Why are we fighting? Why do we need this incident response plan? Well, let's face it, your organization is going to get attacked. It's now a $600 billion plus industry around the planet. Australia contributes something like 20 billion to that, roughly, I believe, was the last numbers I looked at. And if you look at the chart on the left, organized crime is by far the biggest winner in that particular environment. So whilst organizations are getting attacked by nation states for various different reasons, or former employees, or even current employees, by and large, most of the stuff that you and I are going to be dealing with is organized crime. And that kind of makes life a little bit easier, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. It makes it more difficult because you are going to be a target regardless of what you do. That's just a matter of fact. If you have any way, shape or form that they can earn money off you, then you will get attacked. And it makes it easier because their motivation is money. So as soon as they start losing money on your particular attack, then they probably will move on to someone else. So as for targets, sometimes we have organizations tell us that, we're not really a target. But if you look at that list, pretty much every industry sector is represented quite nicely. It looks like not-for-profit is a good industry to be in, because you're not going to get attacked as much. That's mainly because they're probably using you to clear and cleanse credit card numbers. One of the things that we find often in not-for-profits is that because they're donations, they accept donations, they'll get the smaller donations to check credit cards to see whether the credit card actually works. So that's a problem specific to not-for-profits, especially ones that take donations. But it won't surprise you if you look down the bottom, there's the financial and the high tech. Pretty much what you would expect, because that's where the money is, and those that have money are a nice ripe target. Healthcare is quite prominent there as well. And that's mainly because, and similar to retail and hospitality, to be honest, and that's because often they're seen as a soft target. So if you're in those sectors, you are definitely going to be a target, because they think you haven't got your security sorted out. Therefore, you're not going to notice. Therefore, they earn more money out of you. So everybody gets attacked. It's just a nice big tarred brush, and it's quite consistent. Organizations that sometimes say, we don't get attacked, I suggest people have a look at their firewall logs, and you'll see things bouncing off there. And pretty much every one of those is going to be an attack of some sorts. Now, your firewall's protecting you, which is great, but when you think about it, if any one of those got through, then that would mean that someone would have to spend time to actually clear up the mess and the incident. So, if you're one of the organizations that gets, I don't know, even 1,000 attacks a day, if you need to justify a team member, 1,000 attacks a day times 3-4 hours or so to try and fix the issue, that would be a significant cost to the organization. So what you're up against, you're up against essentially a criminal service industry. It's no longer a single person sitting there somewhere, or even a single group doing everything. Just like normal IT, things get outsourced, things get specialized. So you have specialists that will go and grab credit cards. You have specialists in authentication systems. You have specialists in all kinds of aspects of IT security, and also particular types of systems. And you can rent them all. So yeah, these are just some of the people that you're up against. Now, most of these ones are in jail, which is kind of nice to know. There are a few favorites here. There's this gentleman here. I hope that comes through on there. In the corner there, maybe an arrow will do better. There we go. This gentleman here, he was the WannaCry guy. So obviously, he was the hero because he helped fix it, until someone said, oh, actually, he might be the one that released it in the first place, or one of the few that released it in the first place. There's another gentleman here in the middle there, just here. He went on holiday after doing a particular hack to Thailand and got picked up there, and is still sitting in jail waiting to be extradited. So he's not having a fun time. But he was part of a larger criminal ring. It wasn't just him, he was just one of the players. These two guys here, let me see if I can draw it on the face. There we go. I'm going to put a scar on his face. There you go. Those two guys there, they were part of an organized ring where there were lots of credit cards. They actually printed new credit cards, handed out the cards to a whole team of people in several different countries, and then organized for them all to hit the ATMs at pretty much the same time. So something like $110 million was withdrawn from ATMs around the world in different teams. These two guys, they got caught probably the dumbest way ever, by posting this particular picture on Facebook. So that you can't quite see it, but in the bottom of that picture, there's a large stash of cash that they've got in their hands. So well done, boys. Again, part of an organized crime specializing. Now, these guys are just the stooges. They're not the brains behind it. Right underneath that picture, the bunch of Nigerian gentlemen who got picked up, again, part of a big online scam as well, quite active. And if you've been keeping track in the papers, there's been some people that have been picked up in Australia recently as well that were involved in various online scams. The one I kind of feel sorry for is this little dude here. So he's not necessarily, there we go, there's my little arrow. Worst arrow ever. He's not necessarily a super criminal, but he just ran foul of one of the acts that says thou shalt not use automated bots within online gaming environments. So he was using a bot to basically do his resource farming and gold farming for him, and got picked up about 10 minutes after the law got enacted. They were waiting outside of his house and took him in. So that's kind of the people that we're up against. On the nation state side of things, we have a few of those as well. Here we go. These gentlemen, some of you may remember these. These were the Russian gentlemen that were picked up in Den Haag, I believe it was, and linked to the poisoning of Russian national in the UK. So, there's a nation state element to a lot of the attacks. So this is what you're up against. That's just the people side of things. Lots of people, lots of different circumstances, lots of different reasons why they hack other countries and organizations. But, the criminal element, it's there for the money. They have their processes, they have their tools. This is just a denial of service for hire. It's online, Ninja Boot. You can go to ninjaboot.com and you'll have the same services available. $14.99 a month. You can DDoS one concurrent attack per day if you like. So DDoS anybody you like on the planet for $14.99 months. You could do the $9.99 one, but that's only 900 seconds. So, maybe that's not enough. That's a little bit over 10 minutes. Although that one's often used in the ransomware. So they do the 900 seconds on a particular site, then send an email saying, hey, you know how your site wasn't available the last 10-ish minutes? Well, that was me. Give me 20 grand, otherwise I'll do it again. So, there are other sites available, NetStress, for example. I don't necessarily see how an NTP attack, which is the first one of 20 gigabits per second, is considered a stress test of an organization. That would probably take most of the country down. Certainly most of the organizations that I know would be down by that. So again, a service that's available online. And of course, you've got your specialists in this case. Those were the specialist DDoSers. You've got your salespeople as well. So, you know, if you need to sell your credit cards, you might have found the credit cards, but you're not particularly good at sales. Well, then you hire a salesperson to do that for you. So this is one of the websites where credit cards get sold. So the Australian credit cards, I'm very sad to say, have gone down in price. They used to be about $50 a pop. They've gone down a little bit, so which is a bit of a shame. His spelling is not too great either, because Sweden is a bit of a challenge there. But available, and the credit cards are available on different places. I've got another slide coming up later on for credit cards. This one's kind of interesting when you have capture solving services. So a lot of us have captures on our websites. That's not really much of a barrier. What happens is when the capture pops up, the attacker, their script will take that capture and send it off to a capture farm in India or China, etc. So, or one of these particular services here. And then you have a person look at that capture and type it in, and then life goes on. So it slows the attack down a smidge, but not necessarily all that much, unfortunately. So there's a service for that as well. Again, specialist service. They have some technology sitting behind it as well. So this is one of the web shells. This is quite common. So this is a piece of code that's placed on a web server, and then after they have access to that web server, they can do whatever they want. So it's also called a remote administration tool. So this one here is the whole $25, or you might want a hidden TeamViewer VNC. So it looks like TeamViewer, but it's actually VNC, you know, $75. Yeah, I guess the attackers can spend money, but this is specialist coders writing code for the criminal activities that go on. They could, of course, just download it for free. So, you know, the expired domain sniffers in this case is another particular attack. So expired domain sniffers is just watching domains that are about to expire, because usually that goes to the accounts team. So the accounts team might not pay it just yet because their payment run is next week. And then in the meantime, the domain expires, and these kinds of tools sit there watching them, and then they'll sell them back to you at a premium. So various tools downloaded for free. Oh, there's the rat that I was looking for. So on a couple of slides ago, it was for sale for $25, but you can actually just download it for free. So this one has a particular nice feature, webcam light off. So you can activate the webcam and not turn on the little warning light that says the webcam is on. So this is quite popular. This one is kind of used in some of the extortion ones that go along that say, send you an email saying, hey, I've been watching you whilst you've been watching porn and things like that. Now, 99.9% of those ones are all scammy, but technically something like this would kind of lighten it up a little bit for the attacker. And then this is my favorite. This is Chen Solo Mofokin. So the reason I put this one here is because I was reading that Facebook went through a big effort of making sure that, you know, credit cards and things like that weren't being sold on Facebook. After I read that, I kind of went, oh, okay, really? So I did a little quick Facebook search, and, you know, this guy and probably another 100 or 1,000 others popped up. Now, he at least registered with a fake name. I know, who would have thought that on Facebook you could register with a fake name? But David Kenji down the bottom there, who's a very satisfied customer, he posted there under his real name saying, hey, yes, I bought one of your Australian credit cards, and look at all the money that I withdrew from ATMs using that stolen credit card. So I'm kind of hoping that he got a visit from police somewhere, which would have been nice. One of the things that we have in common in a lot of the incidents that we come across is just a lack of resources and lack of skills in the organization. You know, so I'm kind of hoping that there's nothing really new in this list here for people. So security is an afterthought. That's kind of a common complaint from security professionals around the planet since I started back in the early 90s. There's a lot of cloud assumptions out there as well. So especially with Office 365, when we work a business email compromise incident, which I'll go through a little bit later, One of the things is always, but surely X, Y, Z. So, well, yes, but the attacks are tailored for those environments. The attacks are tailored for default settings. The attacks are tailored for organizations that don't do more than just move their mail into cloud environments. So there's a lot of assumptions that people have about cloud must be secure. It's not. I always encourage people to think about cloud as the security in the cloud is at a level that the least secure minded customer of that cloud service is willing to put up with. So, you know, they might be able to do better, but that's not necessarily the default. And then, of course, the other straightforward things are, you know, weak applications. When we do penetration testing, you know, we come across sometimes quite interestingly easy exploitable things, and sometimes they, you know, the worst one I ever had was just a line of comments within one of the web applications saying, if this can work, then use this user ID and this password. So they actually had it in a web application. That was a bit of a boo-boo. Weak networks and complexity. Complexity is probably the biggest thing that you need to be aware of in your environment. You know, a lot of organizations don't necessarily know where their information is anymore because it is in cloud environments, on premises, on laptops, on iPads, on mobile phones, etc. So, you know, I would encourage you to try and figure out where stuff is, just so you can help protect it. And that kind of goes to the next one as well, lack of visibility. A lot of organizations don't have much visibility in the environment. One conversation I had a few years ago with someone is saying, oh, we don't have any incidents. I said, okay, well, how do you know? He says, well, we don't see any. I says, but you haven't got anything installed or anything that gives you the capability to identify it, so you won't ever see it. Well, yes, was the answer, which makes life really easy for the incident responder. You know, if you don't find anything, you don't have to do any response, but that's not necessarily how the world works anymore, unfortunately. And then a lack of preparation, which we'll talk about in a second, and not learning from past mistakes or successes is something that we find common in many incidents. I worked one incident a little while ago where they had, in a previous incident, noted that these are the things that went wrong, we should fix them. And they didn't do any of it. So they just repeated the same mistakes over and over again. So their incident response, instead of being like 2 hours, was like 4 or 5 days, which they could have easily fixed. So quickly, let's define what an incident is. Lots of different definitions. I mean, this is just from a Google search. So an instance of something happening, an event or an occurrence, I absolutely agree with. But, you know, there's ITIL incidents, work health and safety, risk, OH&S, health and safety, all that kind of stuff. They're not really the ones that we want to look for. But if you add security, ignoring the first one, security forces, that's obviously not the one that we were looking for. But there's definitions from 27001, NIST, the HIPAA ones, GDPR, they all have their own definitions of what an incident is. This one's getting a little bit closer to one I like. So an incident is the act of violating an explicit or implied security policy. So this is the NIST definition and kind of paraphrased by Homeland Security. That one I kind of do like, but, you know, as they point out as well, not everybody has a security policy, and it won't surprise you that my implied security policy is different to your implied security policy. So that adds a lot of ambiguity into what is or isn't an incident. So that's not quite the one we're looking for either. ACSC, so that's the Australian organisation, government. So they define it as a single incident or a series of unwanted or unexpected events, okay, that have a significant probability of compromising an organization's business operations. Bit of a mouthful, but they're getting to the crux of the matter, as in something happening that you don't want to happen. So, but there's some good examples that they've got available on their website, so I encourage you to have a look at it. What we actually use is a little bit of a simplified version of that, but I like short sentences, so I'm quite cool with this. An event, single occurrence of an activity on a system. So that's anything that happens on the system. So user logging on is an event. A web request is an event. You know, a particular process starting is an event. The process stopping is an event. So it's just stuff that happens on a computer. Doesn't make it a security incident. It just means these are things that are happening. So the security incident is defined by one or more of more events that have a level of malicious intent or undesirable outcome. So we've got some examples there. You know, uploading a web shell. To be honest, I think I've only seen one case where an administrator thought it was a great idea to use a web shell that he downloaded from a hacking website to manage a server. We disagreed, as did his managers, but there's probably no other legitimate use for that. So that's nice and easy. Introducing ransomware, there's really no argument whether that's malicious or not. Okay. However, deletion of data, well, that might be malicious, or it might be just unintentional, it might even be an accident. So it's still an undesirable outcome, though. So it still would be considered a security incident, but it's not necessarily a deliberate one. So, but it still needs to be treated as an incident. So what does an incident response plan usually look like? We'll go and do that, but we'll have a poll question first, which Mikhail will put up there now. So if you could do that, then we'll continue in a few seconds. People are still voting, so just be a few more seconds. Cool, thanks for that. So we shall move along. So incident response plan. Here we go. 6 components typically to an incident response plan. These are fairly standard and typical. You'll see them around the internet all over the place. SANS uses them, other organizations use them. It's based on the NIST component. And it's basically the preparation stage, the identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. So we'll step through those. And then what I'll do is I'll step through them with a business email compromise in place. So I'll explain what a business email compromise incident is, and then as we go through each of the stages and talk about them, then I'll show you what that means from a business email compromise perspective. Okay, so we'll step through each one of those. So what's a business email compromise? So the business email compromises, they're a multi-stage scam. Okay, definitely there to make money, and make money they definitely do. The fewest dollars incident that we've worked was something like $60,000 for the incident. I did have one phone conversation with a poor bugger who paid $8,000 for a shed that he'd saved up for 5 months, so that was a bit sad. The biggest one, 4.5 mil roughly, that the organization lost in just one of those incidents. So there's a few different scenarios that come with this business email compromise. So it's the plain old whaling ones, which is an email from a email address outside of the organization saying, hey, it's Marty, the CEO. I'm just about to hop in a taxi or a plane, or going on a cruise for the next 12 days, and can you please pay this particular invoice, and they attach the invoice, and that's it. So that's all it is, but that's outside of your organization, so plain whaling, not really that big a issue usually. The other ones, the others are the target or you are the target, and that gets a bit confusing, but what happens is an email account in the organization is compromised. The attacker has access to that email, and then what they do is they look for transactions or invoices that need to be paid. So when I say you are the target, okay, that is an invoice that you have to pay perhaps, or others are the targets, well, one of your customers has to pay you an invoice, and then they try and subvert either one of those payments. So the ultimate goal is to just get money to be paid into an account that is not the company's account. typically via an email. So how do they do it? Well, typically it's through a fake invoice that gets sent to the company. Someone poses as a C-level executive requesting an urgent payment to be made. Typically, the targets for this are people in accounts payables and receivables, the CFO. We've seen CEOs being compromised, even IT managers. But then what they do is internally they try and propagate their access to an account of interest, so someone that actually pays or receives invoices. So once the account has been compromised, they hijack the transaction. Sometimes they'll impersonate a legal entity. We've seen that as well, saying, hey, it's this particular legal firm, you owe us an invoice, please pay it now. That happens as well. But we've also seen them where they've kind of followed up with not just emails and modified emails, but actual phone calls. So they'll aim that at receptionists or HR or financial services within the organization. So there's a lot of opportunity there. What they often all have in common is, can you please pay this invoice into an account that you've never ever paid it into before? All right, so that's a big flag for business email compromise when someone asks you that. Very common. We're doing about at least 2, 3, 4 incidents per month, depending on the time of the year and the waning or the waxing of the moon. It doesn't seem to matter too much. They still work, so yeah, obviously it's worthwhile attack vector for the attackers, and they've got it set up fairly well. So this is some of the emails that you usually get. So this is something that someone in your organization would receive. You know, click below to renew your password, your net bank. That's quite an easy one. The ones on the right-hand side, the OneDrive, the Dropbox, and the password expired, they're a little bit more successful. We get them through DocuShare. You know, not that DocuShare is involved, but it looks like a DocuShare document. And then it redirects you to an online page where you have to put in your credentials. Once you put in your credentials, that account then becomes the attackers. Then typically what they do is they set up forwarding rules and start intercepting your email. So they start forwarding all of your email to an external account, waiting for that email that says, hey, there's an invoice that needs to be paid. Then they'll jump onto your account and start communicating with whoever needs to pay the account. And then usually it's along the lines of, hey, let's change the payment details. Sometimes they'll actually set up a domain very quickly, you know, so it looks like you're communicating with the actual organization, but you're not. So very successful attack. So there's another one, Outlook, that was sent to me, validate your Outlook. So that's another phishing email. So the thing that they have in common, it's a phishing email, then it's a login to the email account, okay? Then after that, it's set up forwarding rules, wait for the opportunity, interfere with the opportunity, and take the money. One of the attacks that one of the incidents that we worked on, the victim actually received a thank you email from the attacker saying thank you for the $80,000, I think it was. He would be having apparently a blast in a Canadian holiday is what he was saying. So yeah, I guess sometimes they do have a sense of humor. So the preparation stage, stage number 1. Yeah, it is very important to understand how you will know about incidents in the first place. Okay, so you need to have a way for your users to be able to tell you that there's an incident. And I would suggest that you don't have punishment associated with that. We have one organization a few years ago where if you reported that you had a virus on your computer to the service desk, then the next thing that would happen is that you would have someone from the security team come and visit you and say, what did you do? What did you do? What did you do? What did you do? And of course, strangely enough, after that got round a few weeks later, they were no longer having any virus incidents because nobody was reporting them anymore because they basically got scared. You know, the message of, if you tell security about it, you will get beaten up. Okay, so system alerts and third parties. So having your systems in place to make sure that you can get told about these incidents is important. Your key decisions, very important. When does management need to know? All right. Do they need to know at the start of the process, at the end of the process? That's something that you need to decide. When does privacy officer need to get involved? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit further about these on the next slide. What are the likely incidents you will encounter? Business email compromise, I can guarantee you will encounter. There'll be other ones as well, though, that you may see within your particular environment because of your internet-facing infrastructure, because of the way that you use cloud. There's various different incidents that follow into that. And then, of course, you need to have the main steps in there and the resources that you're going to be using. So we'll go through all of that. So for business email compromise, typically, it's going to happen, so you need to have things like your logging enabled in Office 365. You need to set up your alerts for foreign addresses accessing your mailboxes. You need to set up alerts for rule creation, and then have some sort of playbook on what you're going to do at the time. All right, so it's just simple steps. Now, typically, if you switch on MFA, so multi-factor authentication, you are probably not going to be the victim of business email compromise, so that's a good little step. But if you can't do that to all of your accounts, then you will get it at some stage. Now, I'm hoping you can see all of this, but this is basically taken from our incident response process, so just a generic one that we've created. But it's pretty straightforward. Let me see if I can move the mouse. There we go. Get your events, however you're going to get them, through system alerts or through users. Triage the events, so look at what's going to happen, then decide if there's a security incident, yes or no. Create your ticket, do your further analysis, determine the scope of the incident, so how big is it or how bad is it, and is escalation required? So this is a point where maybe you would involve your privacy officer. So, hey, it's actually involving a customer database that's got email addresses in there and various other things, phone numbers, names, opinions, etc. It might even have medical records in there for certain types of organizations, so you will need to escalate that to your privacy officer or legal. Sometimes they're the same person. Assign the severity of the impact and then decide whether you're going to handle it as a BAU event or whether you need to actually get the incident response team together. Okay, that's kind of the typical progression in the identification stage. For a business email compromise, what would that mean? Well, you found forwarding rules, you've found mail redirection rules, you've got emails being sent from countries that aren't Australia by Bill, who hasn't left the country in the last 30 years, but suddenly he seems to be emailing from the UK or from, I don't know, United Arab Emirates. So that would be unusual. So you would investigate those logins from unusual IP addresses to your SharePoint or other components, and then your various phishing emails. That might be a good sign as well. The next step would be containment. So you've done your preparation, you've identified that there's an incident you need to contain. Now this is probably the biggest step. You would investigate the short-term containment. So what are you going to do initially? And first off, where's my mouse? And then there we go. Then you would have a look at external support required. And what I mean by that is you might have cloud environments. So if you've got cloud environments, you might need to get the cloud vendor involved. You might have a nice fancy storage array. Well, unless you have a third level technical support storage array person lying around, you might need to get the vendor involved. You might be hosted in somewhere, so you might need it. You might need the data center people or your hosting provider. So engage with those early, decide whether an asset is critical, and then this is one of those key decisions that you've made at the start in the lesson, in the preparation stage. Are you going to isolate it from the network, or are you going to leave it on the network? But you might have different reasons why you would do one or the other. If you're going to leave it on the network, you're going to be doing a live performance, and then you're going to have to make a decision on whether you're going to require a forensics image. Now, in cloudy environments or virtualization, to me, there's only one answer, which is yes. Do a snapshot, for example, doesn't take long, and once you have a snapshot, then your forensic analyst will be your friend forever because they will love that. That's the full server, just right and ready for analysis. So that's great. Begin your long-term containment. So what are you going to do to get rid of the problem in the first place? And then you've got another escalation required. Do we need to go and tell someone? If you're going to have to tell the CEO something, this is probably the most logical place where you're going to be telling them, saying, hey, we've had a compromise, we're going to be doing things. You don't want what happened to an organization a few years ago where an ABC news crew turned up at the CEO's house at 2 a.m. saying, hey, did you know that you are leaking data on the internet? And he had to rub the sleep out of his eyes and go, oh, I'll go back to you. So you don't want to be that person. Search for additional compromised hosts. If you find some, rinse, lather, and repeat this step for that particular server. If there's no more, then you go into the eradication stage. So containment for business email compromise, pretty straightforward. You know, perform login, password resets for the users. I would always, even if you haven't got MFA enabled, I would just enable it for the affected users that you know about right now, because that stops the attacker cold. Contact the affected users. Now, this may come through your legal or privacy officer, so don't necessarily run out and contact your users and your customers saying, hey, there's been a breach. That will probably upset legal and privacy, so you need to make sure that that's coordinated. And then you identify, you know, the external IP addresses that have been accessing your environment, so you can start dealing with that, find out what else they've been doing. You can do some searches for the logon activity. There's a little PowerShell script that we use. So once you connect it to the O365 environment specifically, you can run the PowerShell and identify any other connections. And then other searches and rules of interest. So if you find a rule that's been created on a compromised account, basically look for that similar rule elsewhere in the environment, and you'll probably find other compromised accounts. And then if you have access to your Azure AD, then that will provide you, or can provide you, a report of risky sign-ins. So you would investigate those further to determine that scope. Which takes you to eradication, which is basically looking at root cause. So once you've contained it and you're happy that there's no more to go, you would go for the root cause analysis, which is basically looking for the phishing email for a business email compromise, to be honest. If the root causes, and now this is a little bit of a cheeky cycle, I will freely admit that. Root cause identified? No. Perform root cause analysis. Root cause identified? No. Perform root cause analysis. Yes, I know that's cheeky. We've seen a lot of post-incident reports where what was the root cause is essentially a shrug of the shoulders. Now, that's not really acceptable. Even if you can't identify the specific email or the specific process or the specific file, at least have a solid theory around, you know what, this is probably the only way that it could have happened. We haven't identified the exact email just yet, but this is how it has to work. Therefore, we're comfortable that that was the root cause. And that allows you to determine your remediation actions. So, yeah, and you would perform those remediation actions on the system that you have at hand, see if it's actually fixed the problem. If it hasn't, then you need to go back and find another way of fixing the problem. So the eradication stage is really when you're getting ready for recovery before you're putting it back out there. Business email compromise, that would be identify your root email, identify who else it was sent to, you know, identify the actions performed, etc. If you can't find a root email, look harder or further back. Sometimes it takes between 2-3 weeks before they'll actually touch the account. So the phishing email will be sent out, say, on February 1, the first access to the account won't be until February 14, 15. Then the emails are starting to get forwarded, and then the next touch might be at the end of February. So, you know, a month can go past, some other months go past. If you still can't find that initial phishing email, check again, but maybe it's a drive-by. So some attacks are now coming via web services. So you're going to, I don't know, check the cricket score, and then suddenly you end up with a malicious file on your machine. That happens, or compromised account, or you get asked to authenticate, etc. And if you still can't find it, then you'll have to formulate some strategy to say, hey, let's go back to identifying that root cause, or this is the most likely method. Eradication, do MFA. That's going to sound a little bit repetitive, but MFA on O365 is the best thing you can do. And then also have your logging switched on. There's nothing more irritating than trying to work an incident when there are no logs available at all. It's a short incident response. The answer is usually, yep, can't see anything. So, and teach users not to click. That's probably a good thing as well. That takes you to a recovery stage. So at recovery stage, you're rebuilding your systems, you're applying your remediation actions, you're doing some pre-deployment testing. Don't do what some organizations do, saying, oh, we'll just go back to last week's backup. No, they were compromised like 2 months ago. This is more for a system compromise rather than business email compromise, because it doesn't really apply here. But yeah, make sure that you actually have a clean system. So we always recommend build from scratch and only take data across if that's possible. Don't copy and paste from the previous server. I worked the same incident 6 times for one organization a few years ago. Yeah, they just kept recovering the server and then calling me up about an hour later saying, hey, we've been compromised again. And then we would give them recommendations, which included rebuild. And they said, yeah, rebuilding takes too long. We just recovered it from the data from the backup. And strangely enough, they got compromised again. So yes, and that takes it to lessons learned as well. They obviously didn't learn the lesson. Determine the monitoring requirements. So in our monitoring team, we've got a little bit of a mantra that says, find it once and automate. So we very much like, identifying a compromise once, identify how it was done, see what the indicators were, and whether there's any kind of monitoring that we could put in place to actually detect that quickly. So in the business email compromise, that's pretty much an alert on when forwarding rules get created by any user in your organization. That's the early indicator. You pick them up in a few minutes then. And then once you're happy with that, then put it back into production. So nothing much to do at this stage, but MFA and your monitoring. And then of course that takes you to your lessons learned, which is do your incident review, identify your action items, and generate your incident report. So what did you do well, what did you do badly, and what would you do differently? So how fast did you identify it, how fast did you contain it, what worked, what didn't, and did your playbook work? So did the steps, the specific steps for that particular incident, did they actually work? Okay, which I believe takes us to the second poll. So just a quick second poll on what best describes your organization's IR resources. All right, thank you very much for that. That brings us to the team. So an incident response team, you don't formulate an incident response team for every little thing that happens. It is something more substantial. If you get a virus alert on one machine, you probably wouldn't bother calling the incident response team together. You just deal with that as BAU. If you have 1,000 machines and you get a virus on 900 of them, then that's probably an incident that's worth calling the team together and see what's going on. Typically, the team that we have is of these kind of 7-ish types of people. So representation from management. There's always good to have a management liaison that can, basically tell management, yes, we do need to do this. Yes, this is important. No, that server is going to stay offline for a little while longer. So someone with that level of authority would be good to have at least as part of the team. We typically do a primary handler. So the primary handler, they coordinate the activities and they're also the tiebreaker. So when you have 2 analysts or 2 technical SMEs saying, hey, I think it's this, we should be doing A, and the other one says, no, I disagree, it should be B, then the primary handler is the one that makes the decision saying, look, we're going to do A first, and then we're going to do B, or maybe you work on A and delegate the tasks to other people. So that's important to have. You can't have too many chieftains, you just need one. And they handle communication to management as well. There's nothing more annoying for an analyst, to be honest, to have management standing behind them saying, what's that? What does that mean? Why are you doing this? Did you look at the widgets? Did you check the sprockets? That's just slowing people down. So the primary handler kind of is that buffer between the analyst and management. And the best thing to do there is just to have regular tie-ups with management saying, hey, look, leave us alone for the next 45 minutes. We'll update you at midday. and that's much easier. Now, the communications person is a little bit different to that. This is more how you're going to handle external communications. So that person should be available at some stage. Legal might get involved, depending on whether you've decided to prosecute or whether there's other legal implications of what's done. Let's say you are holding data on behalf of another organization and you've kind of lost it. That has potentially legal implications, because that might be a breach of contract, that might be all kinds of other things. So having a legal person nearby or on the speed dial is probably a good thing. If it's dealing with private information, then you're going to need that privacy officer. So what we've increasingly seen is a critical incident response person. So now typically these people get involved when, I don't know, the CEO goes on TV and says something terrible, and then there's going to be some sort of response to that, and it was bad for the organization, and the critical incident response person fixes that. If you're thinking about TV shows, I think the TV show Scandal, that's kind of the critical incident response. But increasingly, we see them involved in incident responses, especially business email compromise, because there's a lot of moving parts there. Technical SMEs, obviously, you're going to need the technical expertise. This is probably one of the key issues in incident response. Sometimes you get an incident responder who thinks they know absolutely everything about everything there is to know. They are wrong. They need to understand where the limits are, and call in the networking guy, call in the server guy, call in the cloud person, call in the forensics girl. It's just knowing where the limits are and where you're going to need the expertise. And of course, you need your analyst. So that's typically what your team is going to look like. And you might have some of them, you might have all of them. It depends on the incidents itself. The important part is that the plan evolves over time, because your business changes, the attacks change. You might have an exercise, incident response exercise. You should probably do one at least once a year, if not twice a year, and have some nice scenarios. So if I was doing one tomorrow, I'd probably be doing it on business email compromise and maybe a national data breach. So just pretend that you've lost your customer database, and you might have to report that to the Privacy Commission. So that would be a good exercise to have. And then, of course, apply your lessons learned. So once you've gone through that lessons learned, make sure that you actually do that in your plans. So very quickly on your obligations, I realize I'm going a bit slow on some bits. I do apologize for that. Your obligations, notifiable data breach. So that came in last year, which is that if you lose any kind of personally identifiable information, you have to report that fact to the Privacy Commissioner. So many organizations, what they need to build into their incident response plan is, when are you going to get the privacy officer involved? What are you going to do when you lose, potentially customer information or that personally identifiable information, even staffing records, HR records, and things like that. The thing with business email compromise is, when they access your mailbox, they set up that forwarding rule that forwards all the emails outside of the organization. So if this is the HR person, all of the HR emails have just left the organization. All right. Also, they have access to your Office 365. So potentially, if you're using SharePoint or OneNote or any of the Microsoft Online services, they potentially have access to all of them. Now, again, this is kind of where the money factor comes into it. Because they're after money, they're not necessarily interested in what you have on your SharePoint. However, we have worked several incidents where it was accessed, and that organization ended up having to notify. So, your notifiable data breach, make sure that you have your plans in place, make sure that you have a plan in place to identify what is personally identifiable information. It'd be good if you know where it is in the first place. That's probably a good starting point. But having your privacy officer understand when you have to notify and when you don't have to notify, and what decision steps you're going to make is the main thing. The Privacy Commission, if they find out about a breach and they come to you, the best thing you can have is actually, here is our process, these are the steps that we've taken, and if they're reasonable, then you probably won't get fined. If they look strange, weird, or unworkable, then you may be up for some financial penalties there. From an incident response plan perspective, you know, pretty much every security standard will have the words in there, have an incident response plan, so that's nice and straightforward. It doesn't really matter what framework you work under, if you work under the NIST cyber defense framework, or whether you do 27001, or whether you do you know, ISMS, it's all in there. Yeah, and then you've got some industry-specific standards as well that some of you may be working under. So if you PCI DSS, there's definitely an incident response component there that you know you have to have in place. You have to have certain scenarios or playbooks available as well. The federal government ISM, so the Information Security Management Standard, that has a component in there that says thou shalt do incident response. So, you know, incident response is pretty much core of what you are going to do. APRA, if you're under that, there is a clause in there that says thou shalt do incident response. So basically, you're going to have to do it at some stage, and it just basically makes sense. So you might as well make it work for you properly. And that, I think, is pretty much all we have. So Triage, you know, it's a service that we provide. You can learn more about that on our website.